Episode 26, Battle of the Big Shots. The party had ended very late and was a huge success. The students really enjoyed it, and they all made sure to thank Elliot before leaving. Elliot was delighted everything had gone so well. After settling the bill, he took a taxi back home. When he arrived home, he wasn't tired, so he took out his phone, switched on Starstorm TV, and entered the Masked Girls live streaming room. He had initially invested in Starstorm TV because the platform's interface was cutting edge and had huge development potential. As a consumer, he had been impressed by its user experience and believed others would think the same. He believed it would be a solid investment. As Elliot entered the Masked Girls live streaming room, he quickly discovered that the room's popularity had massively increased, with the number of visitors tripling since his last visit, and the Masked Girl had gained thousands of new followers. It seemed that the gift he had given her last time had had a major positive impact, and had attracted a lot more viewers to her broadcast. The Masked Girl greeted Elliot personally when he entered the room and sang a song to welcome him. This sent ripples of jealousy through the room, and looking at the messages appearing on the public board, many viewers were not happy with this special treatment. Elliot just smiled to himself and sent the Masked Girl 10 spaceships worth $100,000. The viewers who had been jealous of him before now applauded his generosity, and he even got a few likes. Elliot thought, I'm the big shot here sending the cash, so I'm entitled to a bit of special treatment. Anyone who isn't happy can go fend for themselves. Indeed, it seemed there was another big shot in the room because as soon as Elliot sent through the 10 spaceships, another user immediately followed with 15, worth $150,000. The atmosphere in the streaming room started to heat up, with the other viewers getting excited and cheering on the guys who had money to throw around. Although Elliot was happy the Masked Girl was receiving gifts from someone else, he started to think of this guy as a bit of a rival. Without hesitating, he tapped his phone screen and sent the equivalent of $300,000 through cyberspace. His online opponent hadn't shown any sign of backing down, and followed Elliot's donation with spaceships worth $400,000, hoping to stop Elliot in his tracks. But he immediately retaliated with 200 spaceships, $2 million, and the live streaming room exploded with excitement. No one could believe that anyone would be so generous to donate a single gift of $2 million. Comments started filling the public screen. These big shots are mega impressive. Rich people have all the power. I've never seen such generosity before in my life. This must be the richest guy on Starstorm, sending $2 million. It's unbelievable. Awesome! Kudos to that dude. Tributes were pouring in for Elliot, and reports of events in the room had spread throughout the Starstorm TV platform. Viewers were flocking to the Masked Girls streaming room, which was starting to get overloaded. At one point, there were so many visitors in the room that the platform started to lag and error messages began to appear. The site was in danger of crashing. Elliot's opponent was also in shock. I can't believe this guy's generosity, he thought. How can one person donate $2 million in one go without a second thought? I'm getting out while I can. He knew he had met his match with Elliot. He left quietly without another word, feeling dejected. The live streaming room's popularity continued to surge for more than 30 minutes. A one-time gift of $2 million had never happened in the history of Starstorm TV. Not only did it attract the visitors' attention, but it also encouraged popular hosts to sign up for Starstorm. It was turning out to be great for business. Not surprisingly, Elliot soon received many private messages from other female hosts, inviting him to join their live streaming rooms. They thought that if they could capture the attention of someone like Elliot, they would be set for life. It would be like winning the lottery. Since word had gotten around outside the platform, Elliot received all kinds of messages from ordinary women as well as the female hosts. His generosity had made him very popular. He was too lazy to bother with any of the private messages, but just as he was about to leave the live streaming room, he received a private message from the Masked Girl. Masked Girl, thank you for your gift. You're so kind to me. You're an angel. I don't know how to thank you. Elliot tapped out a reply on the keyboard. Just keep working hard. I think you're the best, and I'll always support you. There was a short pause before he received another private message. Masked Girl, you've given me so many gifts. Do you expect anything else from me? Elliot, I know you're not that kind of girl, and I'm not that kind of guy. I only want to support you. Don't read too much into it. Masked Girl, thank you. Thank you so much. You're honestly the nicest guy I've ever met." She ended her message with a touched emoji. Elliot, "I hope no one pressures you. Just be yourself." Elliot waited, but there was no response from Masked Girl. Elliot, "What's wrong?" Masked Girl, "The company wants me to reveal my face, and they want me to dance. But I don't want to expose my face or dance. I don't know what to do." Elliot, "Never do anything you don't want to do. Hang on, I'll call someone and see what I can do." He took out his phone and dialed Henry Cartwright's number. When he answered the phone, Elliot got straight to the point. "Mr. Cartwright, there's something I need your help with on the platform." "Mr. Branders, as an investor, feel free to ask me anything. How can I help?" Mr. Cartwright was ready to help the platform's new shareholder as best he could. "There's a host called the Masked Girl, and I understand that you have asked that she take off her mask and dance?" Elliot asked him. "Yes, I do seem to remember that request," Mr. Cartwright confirmed. "Look," said Elliot, "I was the one who discovered the Masked Girl's potential. I'm asking you, please don't force her to take off her mask or dance, okay?" Elliot asked. As a substantial investor, he knew he was within his rights to make demands of Henry Cartwright, but Elliot didn't like to operate like that. "Mr. Branders, I didn't know you had an interest in the Masked Girl. Of course, I'll withdraw the request immediately. And don't worry, I'll do everything in my power to increase her popularity on the platform." Henry continued making a series of promises, hoping he would get into Elliot's good books. He didn't want to get on his bad side. "Then I don't think I'll be troubling you again, Mr. Cartwright." Elliot thanked him and hung up, smiling to himself. When he once again switched on Starstorm TV, he had received 3 private messages from the Masked Girl. "Hey, I've just received some good news. Just this second, someone from the platform told me I don't have to take off my mask, and I don't have to dance unless I want to. They've also agreed to help produce my live broadcasting. I'm over the moon." There was a pause before she messaged again. "Of course, I've just realized. It's you again, isn't it? You really are an angel. I don't know how to thank you." After reading the last 3 messages, Elliot smiled and tapped out his reply. "It was nothing. I was glad to help. No need to thank me." Masked Girl, "Who are you? What gives you the authority to influence the platform so quickly?" Elliot, "I'll tell you another time." Masked Girl, "To be honest, my curiosity is getting the better of me. I'd really like to meet you now." Elliot, "Not now. Maybe another time." After sending this last message, Elliot left the live streaming room, signed out of Starstorm, and put his phone away. Then he headed to his study. While he was studying his business and finance books, his cell phone rang. He glanced at his phone and saw it was an unknown number. He picked up. "Hello?" It was Ed Graham at Cyber Superstore. His workstation computer had been assembled and was ready for pickup. "You can pick it up tomorrow," Ed told him. Elliot thanked him and put his phone away. He was finally getting his new computer. He continued studying for a while longer before going to bed. The next day, he woke up early, showered, and headed straight to Cyber Superstore, excited to get his computer. When he arrived at the store, Ed greeted him enthusiastically at the door. "Boss, the computer you ordered is ready and waiting. Come and see." Episode 27, Elliot's Pride and Joy. "All right." Elliot nodded in satisfaction. He glanced at the opposite counter, and when he saw that Luke and Rachel weren't there, he couldn't resist asking, "So why didn't those two come to work today?" "That couple has been arguing a lot lately. I haven't seen them here for 2 days," Ed said, while opening the boxes with Elliot's new computer inside. "Why?" he asked. "I think it's to do with her ex-boyfriend. Something like that. I'm not too sure about the specifics." Ed shrugged. "Oh, right." Elliot nodded, deep in thought. Only when he saw Ed unpacking the parts of his new workstation computer, which had been carefully built to his specifications, did he come back to his senses. Elliot stared at the brand new computer, with its high-resolution screen, top-of-the-line keyboard, and the system console housing the powerful processor and everything he needed for a high-spec PC. He turned to Ed and asked, "How is it? Could you help me test it?" "I've already put it through all the tests. Don't worry, I guarantee there won't be any problems," Ed reassured him. "It's everything you asked for. It works like a dream." Good. Elliot trusted Ed, and he didn't want to waste time testing the computer if it wasn't necessary. "Allow me." Ed carefully put all the parts back in their boxes. Then he said to Elliot, "This is all quite heavy, you know. Let me help you carry the boxes downstairs." "That would be a great help," Elliot said with a grateful smile. He picked up the smaller boxes and walked downstairs ahead of Ed. It's the least I can do, said Ed. This is a big order for me. You know, I would have delivered it to your home if you wanted, he said. Ed followed behind, carrying the large box in his arms. Don't worry, said Elliot. I'll grab a taxi once I'm on the street. As they made their way down the staircase, a young blonde guy heading upstairs suddenly came flying around the corner and crashed into Elliot. Hey kid, are you blind? The blonde guy yelled at him, even though he was the one who hadn't been looking where he was going. The blonde guy was carrying a laptop. He lifted it and said to Elliot, Do you know what this is? It's an alien brand computer and it costs over $5,000. You can't afford to damage it. He swore at Elliot and looked at him with utter contempt. No, by the look of you, you couldn't afford $500. The blind kid laughed. When Ed heard this, he couldn't help himself and burst out laughing. The blind kid stopped and glared at him when he heard Ed laughing. What do you think you're laughing at, old man? Nothing, Ed said. He leaned across and looked at the blind kid's computer and said, Yes, you're right. This computer is pretty good, but it's nowhere near as good as this. He gestured at the boxes he and Elliot were carrying. That computer? Asked the blonde kid. He hesitated and then said, Don't give me that. He looked Elliot up and down and said sarcastically, You're kidding, aren't you? How can that setup be better than my alien? You really don't know anything, do you? Said Ed, and he rolled his eyes at the kid. At that moment, a strikingly beautiful girl came downstairs. Darling, where have you been? She asked the blonde guy. I've been waiting for ages. Izzy, look what I bought you. The blonde guy handed over the laptop. Her eyes lit up when she saw it. Oh, Rob, I didn't expect you to spend so much money. This is a great laptop. Thank you, she said. I love you for this. As she said this, she leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. That idiot didn't even notice it was an alien. He nearly made me drop it. Rob pointed and glared at Elliot. Who? Said Izzy, looking around frowning. She turned to see Elliot and was about to curse him when her eyes lit up. She saw the computer boxes that Elliot and Ed were carrying and exclaimed in excitement, Oh, wow, that's awesome. Ahem. Rob felt a little uncomfortable. Izzy, what's so special about that setup? Don't you know? That's a high-spec, made-to-order workstation computer. Izzy impatiently explained to her boyfriend as she pointed to the boxes. Absolute top of the line, she said, clearly impressed and a little envious. Izzy knew a thing or two about computers, and she knew that the brands used to put this workstation setup together were very expensive. Only a wealthy person could afford to buy one of these customized jobs. I'm sorry, but I just don't believe that computer is more expensive than this alien, Rob said sullenly. He didn't know much about computers, and as he spoke, he began to doubt himself. Rob, you know nothing about computers. Izzy confirmed his fears as she turned and glared at her boyfriend. The motherboard alone is more expensive than your laptop. What? Rob was shocked. He stared at the alien computer in his hand for a few seconds, then looked at Elliot's computer and asked doubtfully, That computer of his is really that amazing? I bet that computer costs at least $20,000, Izzy retorted. What? $20,000? Rob's mouth fell open, and he just stared in disbelief, speechless. Izzy's words sank into his brain. He had thought alien brand computers were the most expensive computers on the market. He had no idea that computer systems could cost as much as that, and he didn't expect a kid like this would have a $20,000 computer. Rob felt like a complete idiot. He had mocked someone's $20,000 computer while he used a $5,000 laptop. He had never felt so humiliated. He stood rooted to the spot, his face bright red, feeling very small. After a moment, Rob held out his hand to Elliot and said, Hey, big shot, can we be friends? Elliot looked at him with disdain. I'm busy, don't have time, he responded. He didn't need idiotic friends like Rob. With that, he walked past Rob and headed downstairs, closely followed by Ed, who was grinning slightly. It was good to see an ignorant and spiteful person put firmly in their place for a change. $20,000 for a computer? He must be loaded, Rob said, looking at Elliot's back as he walked away. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of envy. Elliot immediately forgot about Rob as soon as he left the Cyber Superstore building. He thanked Ed, said goodbye to him, and hailed a taxi. The taxi drove up alongside him, and Elliot put his boxes in the trunk. As he climbed inside, he said to the driver, Please take me to Havensea Gardens. All right, replied the taxi driver, and they set off. The driver glanced at Elliot and asked with a smile, So, young man, why are you off to Havensea Gardens? Installing a computer for one of the rich residents? The taxi driver didn't imagine for a moment that someone like Elliot could live in a wealthy district like Havensea Gardens. He assumed he must be providing a service of some kind, and he saw the computer boxes placed in the trunk. Yeah, sure, that's right. Elliot smiled but didn't correct him. Elliot knew that he would soon have to get his driver's license and buy a car so that he could drive himself around. It would be way more convenient, and he would have to answer all these questions every time he climbed in a taxi. Havensea Gardens is full of super wealthy people, said the taxi driver, making polite conversation. All sorts live there, mainly the rich and famous, but there are a couple of aristocrats too. Did you know that? You should charge them a bit more, you know. They can afford it after all. All the way to Havensea Gardens, the taxi driver chattered non-stop. Elliot responded now and again with a nod or a mumbled word. 30 minutes later, they arrived at Havensea Gardens. They were stopped at the entrance gate by a security guard who told them, "Sorry, only residents' vehicles are allowed to enter the complex." "But the computer we're delivering is very heavy," the taxi driver said politely with a smile. "We'll bring it in, drop it off, and come out immediately afterward," he said. No exceptions," the security guard said. "Residents only." "All right," the taxi driver shrugged helplessly. He turned around to Elliot and said, "I'm sorry, people like us aren't allowed inside such high-end establishments. I'm going to have to drop you here, I'm afraid." "Hang on," said Elliot. "Let me try." Elliot rolled down the window, took out the security card from his pocket, and handed it to the security guard. "What about now? Can I come in now?" Episode 28. Please sell me a car. "Of course, sir. You're the new resident of Riverview Mansion," said the security guard. "Of course you can enter, sir. I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you." He turned to a colleague and said, "Hurry up and open the gate." The taxi driver stared at Elliot in astonishment. He would never have guessed that this ordinary, slightly scruffy-looking kid could be a resident here in Havensea Gardens, the wealthiest neighborhood in the city. This neighborhood was strictly for people with money and power. In order to live here, you had to be incredibly wealthy. Business tycoons and celebrities lived here, and even one or two European aristocrats were rumored to be residents. If this kid lives here, the taxi driver thought, he is definitely someone. "Driver, please go in," Elliot said, interrupting the taxi driver's thoughts. "Okay, sorry." He shook his head, put the car in gear, and drove through the gate. "I just can't believe a kid like you lives in a place like this. Who are you? You must be someone really important to afford to live here." "You've got it wrong," said Elliot. He shook his head and pointed at the imposing house directly ahead. "That's the one. Just follow the driveway and stop by the front door." "Oh, wow. That's Riverview Mansion. Everyone knows it's the biggest, most expensive house in the entire neighborhood. Don't tell me you live there," the taxi driver exclaimed. The taxi driver looked at Elliot again, as if seeing him for the first time, but in a completely different light. It finally registered that Elliot was nothing like the person he had presumed him to be. This kid really must be someone special. It hadn't mattered that the boy just looked like a regular kid, wearing regular clothes with a down-to-earth attitude. He lived in a luxurious mansion among the elite. "Thank you," Elliot said to the driver, as he paid and got out of the car. The taxi driver rushed out to help him with the computer. Once the boxes were unloaded from the trunk, he gave Elliot his business card and said, "This is my number. If you ever need to go anywhere, call me. I'll pick you up anytime, day or night." "Okay, thanks," replied Elliot. He took the card and put it in his pocket. The driver left, and Elliot brought his computer inside. He took it up to his study. Once he had unpacked and set it up, he turned it on, excited to try it for the first time. After thinking for a moment, he decided to play his favorite game, League of Legends, and was amazed by the difference. It was faster, the graphics were crisp and clear, and the sound was incredible. He was thrilled. It was better than he'd expected. His new computer had been worth every cent. He played for a while and then decided to head out. He had initially planned on going to the local driving school to prepare for his test to get a driver's license, but then he decided to put that off for another day. For now, he would keep using his learner's permit. So instead, he decided to go buy a car. He took a cab to Pinewood Boulevard, where all the leading car dealerships were, and walked straight into a Mercedes showroom. The showroom was very grand and luxurious. There were more than 10 Mercedes-Benzes parked inside, but few customers. Several sales staff were hanging around at the back of the store with little to do, just chatting among themselves. The moment Elliot walked in, the staff looked up, but no one made a move to help him. He didn't look like a potential customer to them. He was far too young and wasn't dressed the part in his old jeans and sneakers. Elliot didn't think much of it. He was happy to look around by himself. He wandered around, and one particular model caught his eye. He called over to the staff, I'd like to test drive this car, please. You can't afford it, so what's the point? The saleswoman laughed. How do you know that I can't afford it? Elliot asked politely as he turned to look at her. He saw her name was Jane Spencer, and she was the sales manager of the store. I've seen people like you here before, she said. You dress in second-hand clothes, you don't look like you can afford your next meal, and I bet you don't even have a job. How do you think you're going to pay for a car? She laughed and crossed her arms, waiting for Elliot to respond. The rest of the staff looked on with interest, snickering among themselves. Look, I really need to buy a car, and I'm seriously interested in this one. Why are you being like this? You know nothing about me. Elliot had been in a good mood when he left home, but this kind of attitude was beginning to test his patience. You want to buy a car, right? Jane asked. Without waiting for him to reply, she pointed to a second-hand dealership across the street and laughed. You might be able to scrape enough together to buy a wreck from there. Fine, said Elliot with a sigh. If you don't want the business. He turned and left the showroom. As he headed to the door, he heard the staff laughing. Who does he think he is? One of them said. It's obvious he doesn't have 2 pennies to rub together. I hate it when scum like that comes in and wastes our time, said another. I bet he can barely afford his bus fare home. He opened the door to head out and heard Jane say, In the future, I don't want you to let his kind even get their foot over the threshold. People like that scare off our real customers. You can smell their poverty a mile off. The door slammed behind him, and he couldn't hear their voices anymore. He headed next door to the Ford showroom. While he had initially wanted to buy a Mercedes-Benz, after the attitude of the staff, he had changed his mind. I don't need to spend money on a foreign car, he thought. I might as well support the American car industry. The Ford showroom wasn't as big as the Mercedes store. There were fewer cars and only 3 staff members. As he walked in, the saleswoman greeted him politely. Good morning, sir. My name is Joanna Woods. How may I help you? I'd like to buy a car. Elliot's first impressions of this store were promising, much more professional. We have several cars here. This one over here, Joanna began. Wait, said Elliot, stopping her in her tracks. He was looking at the car toward the rear of the showroom. I like that car. That car is really something. Can I take a look? He started to walk toward the Ford GT supercar. He loved the shape, which reminded him of a Porsche, and it had great reviews as a top high-performance vehicle. Joanna said awkwardly. Look, why don't you take a look at this one over here? She smiled and tried to direct his attention to another vehicle near the front of the sales room. This is the new Ford Edge. You don't like the Ford GT? Asked Elliot. No, it's not that, said Joanna. It's just very expensive. The Ford Edge is much more reasonable, said Joanna. You think I can't afford an expensive car? Asked Elliot, raising an eyebrow. No, that's not what I meant. Joanna was embarrassed. She wasn't explaining herself very well. She had recommended the Ford Edge because it was fairly ordinary but reliable and affordable. It was popular, and for good reason. It was a great car, and brand new, it only cost $40,000. I like that one. Elliot pointed over to the Ford GT supercar. How much is it? He had liked this car from the moment he set eyes on it, and the more he looked at it, the more he liked it. The Ford GT supercar is $500,000, Joanna said. I'll take it, Elliot said in a heartbeat. I love it. It's perfect. He took out his bank card and handed it to Joanna. I'll pay with this, and then you can help me with all the paperwork. Sorry? Joanna was dumbfounded. She looked at Elliot's bank card and said, You're not serious. You don't want to test drive it first? He looked directly at her and said, Look, I'm very busy. I don't have time for games. Do you want the sale or not? But Joanna felt out of her depth. She wasn't sure how to react. Apart from the fact that this might be the quickest sale I've ever made, Joanna thought, I can't believe this young kid actually has the cash to buy a top-of-the-line luxury car, one of the most expensive in the world. Please, could you just get on with it? Elliot was getting impatient, but he didn't seem to be joking, so Joanna took him to the front desk. She confirmed the amount and started putting the transaction through. He was prompted for his security information, and once that was provided, payment confirmation was received. It took less than 2 minutes. Joanna couldn't believe her eyes. It hadn't been a joke, and she had just made the biggest sale of her career. When the reality had sunk in, Joanna completed the transaction and handed a receipt to Elliot with his card. She was grinning like a Cheshire cat and could hardly conceal her excitement. I can't believe that payment went through, she said. Elliot glared at her and said, Of course it went through. Why? Did you think I didn't have the money? Why would I come here if I didn't have the money to buy a car? Sorry, I didn't mean that, she said, obviously flustered. You don't understand. I've just sold a $500,000 luxury car. My boss is going to be very happy, and I'm going to get a nice big commission." He softened when he saw how excited she was. She looked like she had just won the lottery, just standing there, speechless, beaming from ear to ear. Episode 29. The Sale of the Year. Ahem. Elliot coughed discreetly to get the salesperson attention. "Can we go through the paperwork now?" Joanna seemed to come to her senses and realized she wasn't behaving very professionally. She calmed herself down and looked Elliot in the eye and said, Yes, of course." She still found it hard to believe that this person had the means to pay for a luxury car. He was dressed in ordinary clothes, had an ordinary appearance, but the ease with which he spent $500,000 clinched it. He evidently had plenty of money in the bank. The way he had paid for the car was as if he were paying for groceries at the supermarket. He didn't bargain or request any special deal. He saw something he liked and bought it without a second thought. Joanna had been selling cars for 2 years. This was the quickest sale she had made, and the first time she had met a customer like Elliot. It was no wonder she was a little stunned by the events of the day. She hurried to the desk to fill out the necessary forms. "Please wait a moment, sir," she said. "I'll complete the rest of the paperwork for you right away." When colleagues discovered that Joanna had sold a top-tier luxury car, they were delighted for her and offered to help with the paperwork. With all 3 members of staff working together, the formalities were dealt with in no time. "Congratulations on becoming the owner of a new Ford GT supercar," said Joanna, as she handed over the folder with all the paperwork. "How about we take it for a drive?" she said, as she handed him the key and walked to the passenger side. "Okay, let's go." Elliot sat in the driver's seat and started the car. He grinned as the engine roared into life. The sound was exhilarating. This was his first car, and it was no wonder he was so excited. He put the car into gear, stepped on the accelerator, and drove slowly out of the showroom. They had to pass in front of the Mercedes showroom to get onto the road. Mercedes staff had heard the unmistakable sound of a high-performance car leaving the Ford showroom, and had gathered outside to look. As the Ford GT approached, Jane stepped out into the path of the car, forcing Elliot to stop. "Hey, aren't you that loser from before?" Jane peered at Elliot with a smirk on her face. Elliot said nothing, but Joanna impatiently said, "Jane, get out of the way. I'm taking my customer to test drive his new car." Jane and Joanna had known each other for a long time. Joanna used to work with Jane at Mercedes, but Jane and her colleagues had bullied her. When she couldn't take anymore, Joanna left to join the team at Ford, who were much more supportive. "Joanna, how could you be so stupid to let a loser test drive a car like that? He couldn't afford rollerblades, let alone a car." Jane laughed and looked at her colleagues. "Yeah, Jane's right," they agreed. "This deadbeat came to our store first. We kicked him out." "Mr. Branders has just purchased this car," Joanna said. Hearing this, Jane and the rest of the Mercedes sales team burst out laughing. "You're kidding. I don't believe you." Jane stood, crossed her arms, and said, "If this loser bought this car, I'll eat that tire." She laughed. The rest of her team joined in and made no attempt to conceal their scorn. "Impossible!" they cried. "This car is worth about $500,000. You can't seriously expect us to believe that someone like him could afford a car like that." The Mercedes team was crying with laughter now. "Look, here's the invoice and the sales receipt. You can see for yourself." Joanna couldn't be bothered to argue. She waved the paperwork at them. Jane glanced at the sales receipt, and her mouth fell open, but she still refused to believe it. "It's got to be fake," she said, but somehow she knew it wasn't. It looked like a genuine receipt. The amount was there for anyone to see. This kid had paid $500,000 for a top-of-the-line Ford GT supercar. "Oh my God," she cried. She was dumbfounded. "What? He actually paid cash." This was no joke. If he could afford to pay for a car like this without a second thought, he clearly wasn't who she thought he was. This boy had money. She swallowed and started to feel that the joke was on her. She had humiliated this guy, practically chased him out of the showroom, and yet it turned out he was genuinely wealthy. Jane started to feel pangs of regret. This customer had walked into their showroom, and through stupid ignorance and prejudice, they had lost an opportunity to make a huge sale. Instead, the Ford showroom next door got the business. "Everyone out of the way!" Elliot shouted as he glared at the Mercedes sales team. Jane and the rest of the team slowly started walking away. At the last minute, Jane's attitude changed, and she tried to thrust her business card at Elliot, groveling. "Sir, I'm sorry about earlier. If you ever need another car, you know where to find me." She knew that a customer like him would mean a great commission, so she didn't want to pass on the slightest opportunity to get him back on her side. Elliot took the card, looked at it, then looked at Jane. "I wouldn't take a car from you if you gave it to me," he growled as he tore her card in two and tossed the pieces out the window. And with that, he drove away, leaving Jane and the sales team full of disappointment and regret as they watched the car disappear into the distance. Seeing all those opportunities disappear, Jane turned around and yelled at her team. "Idiots! How did you chase away such a wealthy potential customer? Don't you need to earn any money?" The team looked away and said nothing. "Open your eyes in the future," Jane continued. "Don't judge a book by its cover. That sort of attitude meant we missed out on a huge sale today." Jane marched back into the Mercedes showroom. The rest of the team followed her, feeling dejected and frustrated that they hadn't been able to see beyond the boy's appearance. Meanwhile, Elliot and Joanna were enjoying their drive. Joanna lifted her head and slowly let out a long sigh. She had been tormented by Jane and her team for so long. They had mocked her, teased her, and bullied her relentlessly. After today, she could finally hold her head high. She smiled when she remembered the look of regret and anger on Jane's face. Joanna felt vindicated and relieved that she would no longer have to tolerate Jane's intimidation and harassment. "I have to thank you," she turned and said to Elliot with a smile. "No need to thank me," he said. "You're a pretty decent person, Joanna. Next time I need to buy a vehicle, I'll make sure to look you up," he said with a smile. "Really?" Joanna asked. She took hold of Elliot's arm in her excitement and squeezed it tightly. Then, as if realizing what she had done, she immediately let go and said, "I'm so sorry. I'm just so happy. I didn't mean it's fine. I don't mind." Elliot glanced at Joanna and noticed she was blushing. They continued to drive for a little longer. Elliot was happy with the car and felt that it was perfect in every way. He dropped Joanna back at the showroom and drove away in his new car. Now that he had bought a car, he needed to get a driver's license. He couldn't keep driving with just a learner's permit. After returning home, he logged onto the internet and registered for driving lessons at a local driving school. 3 days later, Elliot turned up at the driving school, and the first person he ran into was Helen, the head chef of the Riverside restaurant. He realized he was happy to see her again. He couldn't help but think that she looked lovely in a pale blue and white summer dress. "Helen, why are you here?" he said. "She really is a beautiful young woman," Elliot thought, "and no doubt she will have her fair share of admirers here at the driving school." "I'm learning to drive, of course," Helen laughed, brushing her hair behind her ear. "What a coincidence. Me too. It looks like we'll be classmates for a while," Elliot laughed. After their last meeting, he had a pretty good impression of Helen. Not only was this girl pretty, but her heart was in the right place, and she had a sweet personality. While Elliot and Helen were chatting, a man in an expensive suit and highly polished leather shoes approached with an armful of yellow roses. Episode 30. The Fictitious Boyfriend. "Helen, these are for you," the man in the suit said with a smile as he handed her the roses. "Carson." Helen's expression froze. She didn't want the flowers, but she didn't want to appear rude either. The man was Carson Reed. He was head of Reed Trading Company, and they had met at a friend's wedding last summer. Ever since then, Carson had pursued her relentlessly, following her around like a puppy. She had been trying to put him off for a long time, but he was thick-skinned as well as incredibly annoying. When she saw him this time, an idea came to her mind. She looked at him coyly and smiled. "I'm sorry, Carson. You're very kind, but I can't accept your flowers." "Why not?" Carson continued to smile. "I'm afraid my boyfriend might get jealous," Helen replied. "You have a boyfriend?" His face darkened when he heard this, and his smile instantly disappeared. Helen smiled as she took Elliot by the hand and introduced him. "Yes, this is my boyfriend, Elliot." Elliot guessed what Helen was doing, and that she wasn't interested in Carson, so he played along. "Pleasure to meet you," said Elliot, holding out his hand. Carson just ignored it. "Him?" Carson looked at Elliot. All he could see was a scruffy young slouch. He frowned even more. Staring at Elliot with contempt, he said, "Helen, where did you pick up a loser like him?" "Please, Carson, Elliot and I are very much in love. I'm very happy, and I'm not interested in anyone else. I hope you understand," she said. She tugged Elliot by the hand and turned to leave. Hang on a minute. Carson wasn't prepared to give up so easily. He had been chasing Helen for months. He stood in front of the couple, blocking their path. He looked Elliot up and down. So what do you think you can offer a woman like Helen, kid? He said with disdain. Anything she wants, actually. Elliot smiled and wrapped his arm tightly around Helen's shoulders. Feeling Elliot's warm hug, Helen flushed a little, and her heart started beating just a little faster. You? Carson scowled. Then he took a car key from his pocket and waved it in Elliot's face. What about this? He asked. Can you afford this? He pressed the key fob, and in the parking lot across the street, the lights on a blue Mercedes-Benz flashed. It was a decent enough car, definitely the sort of car that could turn people's heads. Nice, said Elliot without enthusiasm. A Mercedes-Benz high-performance coupe. That model retails at about $60,000, Elliot murmured half to himself. So you know this car? Carson proudly asked, as he raised himself to full height, looked Elliot in the eye, and shoved his hands in his pockets. So I have a Mercedes-Benz. What do you have? This, said Elliot as he held out his car keys. Watching him, Carson burst out laughing. A Ford GT supercar? You seriously expect me to believe you drive a Ford GT? You've got to be kidding me. Carson continued to laugh. If nothing else, this kid had a sense of humor. Is that so? Elliot smiled and pressed his key fob. The lights on the black Ford GT supercar, just a few spaces to the left of Carson's Mercedes, flashed. Carson's face froze, and his body stiffened. He stared at the sleek black car and said in disbelief, That's your car? Sure is, responded Elliot, dangling the car keys in front of Carson's face. What do you think? No worse than your Mercedes, is it? Carson's mouth dropped open. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He imagined a kid like this would be driving an old, beaten-up second-hand Ford. Not in a million years did he expect him to be driving one of the best cars in the world. A Ford GT supercar was a top-of-the-line, high-performance vehicle with a price tag to match. He could buy 10 Mercedes for the price of one of those machines. People who drove Mercedes-Benz coupes were flashy, but not necessarily rich. But anyone who could afford a Ford GT supercar was in a league of their own. It's Mr. Reed, right? Well, we've agreed we both have pretty decent cars, but Helen is mine, okay? I'd advise you to stay away from her in the future. She's not interested. It never has been, but she's been too polite to say it. Once he had said his piece, Elliot walked over to his sleek new car with Helen on his arm. Carson gritted his teeth, unable to utter another word. Watching Elliot help Helen climb into the expensive Ford GT, he felt an overwhelming sense of defeat. He had been so sure that he would win Helen over eventually, but no, he had lost out to a kid. He angrily threw the roses on the ground and walked toward the Mercedes-Benz, a car he was once so proud of, but which had today been the source of his humiliation. Elliot started the engine of the Ford, took one last look at Carson, and drove away with Helen in the passenger seat. Although Helen was pleased that Carson had been put in his place, and that he would likely leave her alone now, she couldn't quite understand what had just happened. She didn't know why Carson had been so humiliated. Carson drives a Mercedes, right? That's a German car and a good make, right? She asked Elliot. Yes, Mercedes are great cars, Elliot agreed with her. And this car is great, but it's a Ford, an American car. So what makes it so special? Helen was confused. She knew nothing about cars, but she was curious why Carson had gotten so upset. Because it's this Ford car, Elliot replied. It's a Ford GT. What's a Ford GT? She asked. A Ford GT is a Ford GT, Elliot shrugged. You're impossible. Helen rolled her eyes, pretending to be annoyed. She could never get a straight answer from Elliot, so she took out her cell phone and Googled Ford GT. When the search results revealed that she was riding in a Ford GT supercar worth about $500,000, she was astounded. No wonder Carson Reed had been rendered speechless. She was lost for words herself. How come you can drive such an expensive car? Who are you? Helen asked when she recovered. She blinked and stared at Elliot, waiting for him to respond. This man had bought the Riverside restaurant, and now he was driving around in a car worth $500,000, and she still had no idea who he really was. Who am I? Elliot seemed to be giving it some thought. I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you, he chuckled. Tell me. Helen raised her voice a little. Who the hell are you? Okay, I'll tell you. I am. Elliot's expression changed, and he tried to keep a straight face as he replied solemnly, an undercover agent and the next leader of the free world. Helen threw her head back and burst out laughing. At the sound of her laugh, Elliot's heart skipped a beat. She was an attractive woman to begin with a captivating smile, and her laugh was warm and infectious. He was mesmerized. Before he could stop himself, he said, "Helen, you are so beautiful when you smile." "Oh, go to hell," she retorted. Quick as a flash, Helen realized what she had said. She regained her composure and said in a serious tone, "Look, that man, Carson, he's been bothering me for a while now. You're not mad that I pretended you were my boyfriend to scare him off, are you?" "A pretend boyfriend?" he said. "Of course not. If you ever need a pretend boyfriend, a pretend husband, or even a pretend father for your child, don't hesitate to ask." Elliot smiled at her, only half joking. This girl makes me feel so much at ease, but I end up saying things I shouldn't, he thought. I need to be more careful. Why can't you ever be serious? Helen rolled her eyes but smiled all the same. She couldn't be angry with him. Come on, I'll treat you to a meal to say thank you for what you did today, getting Carson off my back. You'll cook for me? Elliot said, excited at the prospect. He knew she was a talented chef. No, I don't feel like cooking today. I just want to eat, she said. Let's go to the Riverside restaurant then, Elliot suggested. No. Helen shook her head and thought for a moment and said, I know. Let's go to the Starlight restaurant. What made you think of that place? Elliot was surprised. Does she know I own the Starlight restaurant too? He wondered. I used to go there often. There's such a variety of food with so many different flavors. I'm sure you'll love it, Helen said enthusiastically. Without waiting for a reply, she said, It's settled then. The Starlight it is. My treat. And with that, Helen leaned back in her seat with a contented sigh.